This parable is a difficult one which has been used and used and used to try to make us more responsible stewards. Not a bad goal, I must say, but this is not really the parable for doing that, or at least the way we've used it. First, we have to take a look at how the listeners in Jesus' time and his society might have heard this parable. There's some nice nuances that we need, some fine nuances that we need to see. First, talent is not about using our talents, like a musical talent or cooking or public speaking. A talent in this context is a measurement of gold. I mean, it's been convenient in the past to say, oh, but we need to use all our talents. But this is a measurement of gold, which was about, well, 15 years in wages for an average worker. In today's American dollars, at a modest income of, let's say, 50,000, that would be about $750,000. A talent is about 750,000, probably more actually, because our wages are a bit higher than that usually. So the servant who is given 5 talents is entrusted with about $4 million. People hearing this would know that it was said tongue in cheek. There was not that wide a stratification of wealth in that society at that time. Although there was a stratification, there was a separation between rich and poor. But nobody was that rich. Even King Herod, maybe the Caesar. Secondly, usury, or lending at high interest, was a practice that was not only against the Jewish laws, but would make a person seem dishonest and basically bad or immoral in the eyes of anyone who was honest and cared anything about justice. So it's automatically figured when one hears this story that the ones who do this in the story are bad people. Thirdly, making money on the backs of the poor, earning exorbitant amounts just for the sake of earning, without regard for those in need around you, was an outrage to the common, or at least to the good Jew. Protecting the treasure of a master would be what was expected of a good servant. Protecting the treasure. Putting it at risk would not be appropriate. The servants who had gone out and doubled their wealth are really, really bad people who have used others and gained by illegal and unpopular and by unjust means. So I guess perhaps we should look at this parable as a sort of, I don't know, tongue-in-cheek story. Let's think about the way that we've often allegorized this parable and made the householder into God and we the loyal servants. It makes God into a tyrant and an evil and unjust user of others without regard for honesty, without regard for kindness and justice and good works. Maybe it's time again to listen to the basic storyline with all of those things in mind. The master of a wealthy household goes out of town and leaves his servants with varying amounts of his wealth to safeguard. One, he gives about $750,000, a fortune. And to the another, he gives 2 fortunes, about $1.5 million, and to yet another 5 fortunes, or almost $4 million. While the householder is gone, His unscrupulous servants take his money out and gamble it in stocks and high-risk usury and buy up bankrupting farms and banks and unscrupulously sold mortgages. And they manage to accumulate more wealth on the backs of poor workers in foreign countries, working in the worst conditions on the lowest possible wages. But one servant merely puts the money in the local credit union to keep it safe and secure, as any good Jew would want. Keep it safe. When the greedy master of the house returns, he looks past the fact of the risky and dishonest use of the resources and can only see the end of how his huge fortune has grown into more huge fortune. And because the third servant only does the right and honest thing, he will not act according to the abhorrent values of his master, but according to those he would have, according to those he would have had every reason to expect based on any normal master, and therefore for not growing the fortune. He's thrown out into the street by this unscrupulous overlord. What we fail to see is that this is Jesus' parable. It's a topsy-turvy type of parable. Jesus is saying something to the effect that the world is not a wonderful place, and when we do what is right, when we act in a just manner, doing what is expected, like the third servant who buried the treasure to protect it, when we do the right thing, we may not always get the reward that we expect or deserve. Indeed, we live in the kind of world that treats good people with little respect, which uses the poor, which exploits the innocent, and mistreats the common worker. The point is that the kingdom of God is the opposite of this. And our lives on this earth are not about getting ahead on the backs of the less fortunate, but thinking instead of their needs. This week, we're invited to see ourselves not only as guests, but also as blessed co-workers with the master of a household. We're invited to be earners and managers of the resources that are given to us by God for the good of all and all of God's people especially, and even for the sake of the whole creation itself. It's not only a challenge to us to be in this position, but a privilege as well. God trusts you and me. God entrusts to us the care of God's own household, to work hard, to see to all that needs to be done, to care for the household of faith. When Christ returns to receive us and our gifts again, won't it be wonderful to show what we have accomplished? Justice, kindness, equality, the raising up of those in distress, and the welcoming of newcomers and strangers. The parable which immediately follows this, I say immediately follows this one in Matthew chapter 25, is one in which the kingdoms of this world are judged on how they have treated the least of these. They're separated in a final judgment like sheep and goats are separated from one another. The ones who enter into the joy of their master are those who have lived more as the third servant of this parable than as the other two. What are we to do with this parable of the talents? Do we invest with bankers and risk an even further erosion in our pension funds because of their risky and sometimes immoral actions? Do we do a different kind of investment? Were our ancestors who thought the stock market to be a form of gambling and therefore sinful, right after all? If we use this new reading of the parable, maybe we should not try to earn more money. And yet, we Methodists We're told by the founder, John Wesley, gain all you can, save all you can, give all you can. John was very much into the discipline of hard work and not trifling away your time, and well, others such as that, being disciplined. But what John was most concerned about when he said, earn all you can, was not about our individual, personal economic condition, not about earning money to climb the ladder of success, to reap material rewards, to eat higher on the food chain. It was about being workers in God's household. That is the household of all of God's world and good stewards of the gifts of time and energy in relation to that world. This emphasis on earning all that you can is about participating fully in God's healing and creative work in the world. The living that we earn is not only for ourselves, it is again for God's healing and creative work in the world, which means that you have all your basic needs met, sure, and so does your neighbor. And the gospel is preached and taught, and all are fed physically and spiritually. Gain all you can is part of a threefold formula. There's also save all you can, and that's not about your personal savings account either. It's about not just trivially using up resources in gambling or wasting it on pleasures of life, but saving it for both the times when resources are more scarce and for the sake of sharing your excess with those who are in need. As the third part of that formula is give all you can. In John Wesley's classes and societies, none, not one, would think of coming to the class meeting with possessions that were considered to be luxuries when his or her neighbor was in need of food or drink or clothing or medical care. It was unheard of. We must see ourselves as blessed co-workers with the master of a household, not the unscrupulous one of the parable, but in the household of a just and fair God who loves us and deals in fairness and justice and compassion and mercy and expects the same from us. It would be unconscionable for an honest and good person to go out and just make money on the backs of the poor for the sake of just making money to have money. When others were hungry, when others were sick, when the church was in need of, of funding, in trouble, people in trouble and hurting for clothing or shelter, or the church needs a new roof or a new boiler, or the school's failing and falling, the school's falling ruin to lack of maintenance. Neighbors are losing their homes. From a Jewish point of view, a good Jewish point of view, why would anybody want to amass that kind of wealth? Why would they want that kind of wealth where they have millions to entrust to servants? The listeners would have a hard time believing that this could be so in a just society. Looking past our own doors and seeing people in need. For this kind of wealth to be held and not used to help fellow humans would be not only cruel, but would make them, that is the money makers, outcasts. This, however, was what was happening in their world as they were under the heavy taxation upon not the wealthy, but the poor of the society, as Rome and those who were servants to Rome, including the temple authorities. Why did Jesus discuss them so much? They were getting richer and richer. No wonder Rome feared people like Jesus and feared what he was teaching them. They were afraid of the people rising up against them. I hope that you are seeing, as I am, the connections and excuse me, and parallels to our present day situation. The rich getting richer, and the gap between rich and poor wider. The poor being taxed, and the rich benefiting from it. Unscrupulous usury, outlandish, outlandish interest on debts, people losing homes and livelihood, the needs of those on the edges being ignored and their work being undervalued, if during this time they have work at all. The people have had enough, and who would blame them for rising up in the streets, Wall Street in particular? Our ruined economy is what happens when unscrupulous wealth is the goal, rather than supplying a living for oneself and others, rather than caring about the needs of everyone and the healing from a pandemic. What does this mean for us today? March in the streets if you must. I want to say that God would have us use the resources with which we are entrusted for the common good, if only to receive our own reward in the words, "Well done, thou good and faithful servant." We're invited to be earners and managers of the resources that are given to us by God for the good of all God's people, and even for the sake of the whole creation itself. It's not only a challenge for us to be in this position, but a privilege as well. God trusts you. God trusts me to be honest and generous with what is entrusted to us. And entrusts us with this work, the work of Jesus Christ, with all that God has, not just to multiply it for the sake of ourselves, but to manage it for the sake of all, to live in freedom and fairness and equality and equanimity and good health, physically and spiritually. I also hope that you will see the work of the church as advocate for that kind of justice and equality and healing in this world, raising up of those who have been the least, last. May we be good stewards of what is entrusted to us. Amen.